Evolution, Chapter 29, Possible Fix. I found it! Jen sat bolt upright with a start as a large book slammed down on the bed next to her. She scrambled away as she rubbed her eyes, catching sight of her cousin. Her hair was down and slightly rumpled, like she'd been running her hands through it. There was a slightly wild look in her eyes. Found what? Jen grumbled as she flopped backwards. She hadn't slept this well in a very long time, without any dreams at all. A solution to Kevin's problem! Jen rubbed her hands over her face and shook her head. You found a magical cure for insanity? Gwen glared and flipped the book open to a bookmarked page. She held it up. It took a minute for Jen to focus on the image on the page. It was a familiar golden device. The Dominus Librium? Gwen nodded, pulling the book back to herself. Exactly! I can draw out the excess energy he absorbed. Michael went too far, probably on purpose, when he used it. If I used it correctly, it won't take Kevin's powers completely, just the energy that doesn't belong. Jen shook her head at her cousin. We broke the Dominus Librium, remember? A voice came from the door as Gwen floundered. Did you break the idol? Both Tennysons turned to the door. Charmcaster stood there holding a stack of clothes Gwen recognized as Jen's. The silver-haired girl stepped over to them and set down Jen's clothes on the end of the bed. She pointed to the face in the middle of the drawing of the device. This bit. Jen shook her head. No, Kevin snapped the arms off of it to save Gwen from the guy using it. Charmcaster nodded. It should still work. But it'll take more time. You may have to restrain him for a while, and I don't know that it will release the energy into the world again, just into a vessel. Jen frowned as she looked over the page. What if we could channel the energy mechanically, use the Librium to draw it out, and release it through a machine attached to a vessel? Charmcaster looked up at her, intrigued. That could work. A clever plan. How'd you think of it? Jen was still examining the page. I used to have an alien that could do something similar. She said it quietly. Charmcaster had a good view of her face from where she sat, and the empty look in deep green eyes made something inside her twist. That was the look of someone who'd lost more than friends or loved ones. That was the look of someone who'd lost a piece of themselves. She didn't push. Gwen nodded, the glint of determination back in her eyes. No, we just need to find the Librium. And Kevin, Jen supplied. Charmcaster stood. I'll track the Librium. At least I can easily do it from here. You'll have to retrieve it on your own, but at least I can find it for you. Gwen blinked at her. Why are you helping us? Gwen asked, a hint of mistrust in her voice. You don't trust me, Gwen. There's too much bad blood between us, I get that. I'm helping your adorable cousin because she saved my realm by returning the Alpha Rune, and because she's willing to give me a chance to be a hero, too. Charmcaster grinned at Jen, who managed to smile back. The silver-haired enchantress lifted both hands, and they glowed for a moment. In each hand, a small pocket mirror appeared. One was encrusted with pink jewels, the other with emeralds. She handed the emerald one to Jen and sat down next to her. These will let us talk when we need to. She opened the pink one and drew a simple rune on the surface of the cloudy glass within. The one in Jen's hands glowed brightly, and she opened it. It showed Charmcaster, who smiled at the brunette before closing her mirror. You try. Gwen raised an eyebrow. She doesn't have any mana control, though. Not without transforming. Charmcaster rolled her eyes at Gwen. Sometimes I forget just how little you know. Gwen glared as Charmcaster took Jen's hand and guided her to trace the same symbol on the glass. Her own mirror lit up. You don't need magic powers to activate these. Just the right rune. The mirrors themselves have enough magic in them. She smiled and opened her own, waving slightly sarcastically at Jen in the mirror. She clicked her mirror closed. I'll let you change. Breakfast is in the dining hall when you're ready. She slipped out of the room with a smile. Gwen looked at Jen and raised an eyebrow. Charmcaster? Jen turned to her and raised an eyebrow right back. Are you really judging my choice in people? Gwen looked down at her feet. Jen hugged her. We're gonna do what we can for Kevin. She's willing to help. I'm willing to give her a chance. Jen nodded. Get dressed. We need to head home. Jen nodded and pushed her cousin out of the room so she could change. She slipped the mirror into her jacket pocket and joined Gwen and Charmcaster for breakfast, after which Charmcaster led them into the back garden to summon the door back to Earth. Before she did so, she pulled Jen aside and whispered a word into her ear, being very careful that she got the pronunciation correct. In case you want to come visit, but don't give it to Gwen. I don't want her popping by to bug me every time she has a magical issue. She grinned and winked at the brunette, pecking her on the cheek. Jen blushed slightly and waved as they made their way out of the doors, waving at Charmcaster as they closed. They were just outside of Bellwood, near the crater. It was near noon, if Gwen's new phone was accurate. They made their way back to Jen's car and found several plumbers searching near it. She clicked the locks on it, making the horn beep, and they all jumped, looking around. Problem, agents? One of them stepped forward. You weren't answering your comm. Jen nodded. That's what happens when you're in a separate dimension. What's going on? Well, Magister Patellidae said to call you when we caught wind of Kevin Levin, and you didn't answer your comm. Both girls stiffened. You in charge of this division? The woman nodded. She was human, or at least looked it, with blue eyes and chin-length brown hair. Good. Catch us up. Now. Jen leaned on her car. The news wasn't particularly good. Kevin had been spotted a few times in the outer rim of Plumber's space, only reported because of the shape he'd left his victims in. The good news so far was that the people he'd attacked were all criminals, and they were all still alive. It seemed they had all owed him something or another. Some of them had just screwed him over on deals. Jen sighed as she made her way back to La Soledad. Gwen was buried in the 4 days' worth of homework they'd missed when they left, originally for Legerdemain. Jen was lucky she had Julie, who was willing to help her with her English, but right now she was more worried about what they would do when they got their hands on Kevin, or more accurately, what he would do when he got back to Earth. She knocked as she entered the old barracks that Cooper was using to build the device in. Just me. Cooper nodded as he began to put together another piece of the device. It was a work of engineering wonder, designed to draw off the power Kevin had absorbed, hopefully without hurting him. Jen stepped up next to Cooper. He turned to her, eyes glowing blue as they always did when he used his powers. Any news? Jen shrugged. He's settling old scores, but there's not a pattern yet. We have no idea where he might show up next. And the list of people who have fucked him over is long. I hold the number 1 position, but no one knows, really. Plumbers are trying to track him, but he's got the camouflage capabilities of a necrophrygian at the moment, so not that easy. Cooper nodded. Neither is this. I can store the energy, even expel it, but draining him without hurting him? I have no idea how to make that work. Jen nodded. We're a step ahead of you on that. She pulled her communicator out from under her shirt and pulled up an image of the page Gwen had found the information on the Dominus Librium on. It's a mystical artifact we've encountered before. Should be able to siphon the power with that and into the rig from there. The only problem is who most likely currently has it. Cooper raised an eyebrow. Who? Michael Morningstar. Cooper's eyes went wide. The guy who ditched us after the fight with the DNA aliens? One and the same. I have a friend looking for the device. If he hasn't chucked it, then we'll find him too. We'll need to convince him that only this machine can get it working again. We'll need an instant release button for when he tries to double-cross us. Cooper nodded. And the kill switch? He asked it quietly. He was against the idea. It was a failsafe, the only thing about this machine that Gwen was unaware of. It would trigger a chemically induced heart failure in whoever the machine was holding, a tiny needle in the cuffs slipping the substance into the prisoner. Jen wasn't convinced that Kevin was able to be saved. He might be too far gone with all the power he'd absorbed, his brain damaged beyond repair, even if they got the energy back out of him. She nodded. Keep it in. We might need it. I really don't want us to, but we might. We'll hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Cooper nodded, and Jen sat down in the corner to work on her science homework and offer what help she could to the blonde technopath. Chapter 30, Not Telling. A week passed, and the only lead they had on Kevin was a human associate he attacked. Frisk had ended up with both legs broken, his right arm shattered, and some severe damage to his muscular system. It was only because the plumbers had found him that he'd retained the use of his legs. Jen drove them away from the base where Frisk was being held until he was well enough to be transferred to Inkarsakon. Gwen had no idea where they were heading. Both girls were silent. In fact, the fact that Kevin had gone so far over something as minor as Frisk not telling him that he'd had partners last time they made a deal, it was rattling. And telling of why they could find hide nor hair of Argit. Jen turned down a side street and pulled up to an apartment. Gwen frowned. "Why are we at Kevin's?" Jen shook her head. "Call it a hunch," she said as she slammed her way out of the car. She glanced around as she pulled a bobby pin from Gwen's hair and began to pick the lock. It clicked after a moment, and Jen pushed the door open. She motioned Gwen aside. The redhead slipped inside. It was trashed. Gwen swore under her breath. If Kevin Levin is anything, he is a creature of habit. Why do you think I'm having his car watched? Gwen stared at her cousin as she stepped deeper into the mess. "You're doing what?" "Kevin's car is under constant plumber surveillance. In case he comes back for it. I wasn't sure he would come back to his house. He's not as attached to it. His mom is currently in protective custody." Gwen stared. "When did you do all of this?" "While you were in class taking your economics test." Gwen frowned. "You're supposed to be in school when I'm in school." Jen shrugged. "Amazing what you can get done over the phone, isn't it?" Gwen's eyes narrowed. "You told Kevin's mom what happened to him over the phone?" "Yes, Gwen, I'm a completely callous bitch. No, I sent Grandpa Max. He knows her better than we do. Now, are you going to talk or are you going to look for clues?" Jen ignored her cousin and began to search through the wreckage of the destroyed apartment. They found nothing until they ventured into Kevin's room, and Jen went through the things on his desk. The symbol scratched into the desk was a familiar one, at least to Jen. Gwen watched her as they made their way to Ed's mechanic shop. "What's the symbol for?" "You really should be doing your homework, Miss Plummer," Jen teased, before growing serious again. "It's the symbol the guards in Inkarsakon use." Gwen's eyes went wide. "Kevin was in Inkarsakon." Jen nodded. "According to his record, yeah. Not for too long, though. About 4 months. Got caught trying to escape by the current warden. The prisoner who was with him was killed in the attempt. Kevin's known to hold a grudge. If he's settling scores, I think that's where he's headed next." Gwen frowned as they pulled into the mechanic's shop. "If he's settling scores, he'll eventually come after me, yeah, but I'm not willing to wait around for him." She locked the doors and waved at Ed as they made their way down into the hole. Pierce was there, filing paperwork. Jen grinned at him. "Hey, Pierce, I need a hand. You're helping out with the prisoner transfer paperwork, right?" Pierce looked at her over curiously. "Yeah." "So, protocol dictates you'd have to know when the next supply skiff goes into Inkarsakon, right?" "Tomorrow, why?" Jen shrugged. "Curiosity, you are the model of efficiency, my friend." She made to turn away. Pierce caught her hand. "This is about Kevin, isn't it?" Jen shook her head, a convincing grin on her face. "Of course not." Her left eye twitched. Pierce frowned. "Because, if it was about Kevin, whom Magister Patelade has strictly forbidden you in particular from going after for at least the next few days, as you are still supposed to be on furlough because of the extreme stress of your last mission." Jen's eyes narrowed at him. Pierce glanced between the two Tennysons. "I would in no way be allowed to tell you that the current code for Inkarsakon's transporter is 6738 Alpha.1265. But of course, telling you that would be against protocol, along with the information that the skiff won't be arriving until tomorrow evening. And if I were telling you any of this, which I'm not, I could also not tell you that Gwen should leave her badge behind, because plumbers aren't allowed in Inkarsakon." "But of course, you're not telling us anything," Jen said, a slight grin on her face as she squeezed his hand in a silent thank you. He nodded.
No, I'm not. I'm also not telling you to be careful.
Jen nodded, and Gwen grinned at Pierce, who went back to his paperwork. Jen nodded to her cousin, who slipped her badge out of her pocket and set it onto the desk just out of Pierce's sight. They made their way nonchalantly to the transporter room. Their reception at Inkarsicon was less than friendly. The warden, Morg, insisted they were violating the agreement between Inkarsicon and the plumbers, which was sort of true, except Jen wasn't a plumber and could go where she pleased freely. Besides, this wasn't plumber business. Morg was still quite miffed at their presence, and that set Jen's nerves on edge. No one was this nervous without something to hide, even when the protocol was technically being breached. The robot guards were of no help, not even explaining why one of the prisoners was escorted away, pushing what looked like a heavy hover cart normally used for mining. Of course, they were locked in their quarters, in reality a double cell. But Jen had a feeling that they wouldn't be there long. First of all, he hadn't wanted them there in the first place. He would get them on that skiff tomorrow evening come hell or high water. Secondly, he hadn't left any spare guards around. He should have if he wanted them to stay put. Jen turned into goop, slipping out from under the door and melting the lock off from the outside. She and Gwen took off down the halls they'd seen the guards take the prisoners. The prison itself was quiet, almost eerily so. None of the prisoners were in their cells. So where were they all? A question Jen got the answer to quite quickly when they found the mining operation under the prison. This isn't supposed to be a labor camp. We need to tell the plumbers about this. This isn't right, Gwen said, conviction in her voice.
I'm sorry to hear you say that.
They turned face to face with Morg and a platoon of his robot guards.
I'm also sorry you didn't take my advice and stay put. I'm beyond sad that the prisoners got to you before I could stop them.
He nodded to his robots as Jen clicked on her communicator through her shirt. Though it was under a simple layer of cotton, it would still work collecting sound without even muffling it.
Kill them both. Tried not to make too much of a mess.
He walked away as the robots cocked their weapons and both girls got ready to fight.